one of the most important things that how you act when these things go wrong. There was a moment about a year ago where I had 12 different deals fall out of contract to sell in like 40 days. That was awful. And I remember sitting there looking at a HUD for another one I was supposed to buy. I was ready to just say, fuck it, we're not buying this and firing everyone and just selling off everything and doing something else. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Big Picture Blueprint. We're talking a bit today about one of the most challenging parts of the business. I think it's something everyone in the real estate industry, or really any commission based, even sales role, will be able to relate to. And we'll get into that shortly. But, Mason, how's it going in Colorado?
Things are good, man. It's end of May. We've got a ton of properties that we're ready to put on the market this summer, and it's been raining almost every day, so everything's turning green, which is
Yep.
exciting. But yeah, no, I think the topic of the conversation today is relevant to us now, just as it was years ago, and will be for years to come.
Yeah. So, what really prompted this, I was having a conversation with a friend about a couple deals coming up, and he was just doing the same. He's in the same business, and we just kind of dwell on the fact of, oh, I might have 100 grand come in next week, or I might have $0 come in next week, because the reality is closings are not a sure thing until the money has been sent and it's closed. And so this is probably the hardest part of this business. How do you plan when you never know what your ARs are actually going to look like? And so, Mason, I think you have a good example of this.
Oh yeah, no, I've got plenty of examples, but I'll try and narrow it down to just one specific one related to that larger portfolio acquisition that I did last year where, there were three specific lots within it that kind of took care of the basis for everything. Acquired everything for about 330,000, 17 total lots. And there were three lots in a county in Colorado that's notoriously very difficult to work with. But based on kind of all the preliminary due diligence, we thought it was good. Turns out, whenever we went under contract, and we went under contract for $300,000, so which would have taken care of pretty much all of my lender's money on the deal, minus just a little bit, and then we would have 14 lots left over. But uh, issues with the county, delays with closing, this, then the other thing, and eventually the buyers got cold feet, and the property's still sitting on the market today. I projected and had conversations with my lenders, and I've been in the business and done enough deals where deals go south long enough of, hey, nothing's real until the check hits the mailbox, essentially. But with that particular deal, in my mind, I started allocating already of like, oh shoot, I'm going to be playing with house money for the next 14 lots, just giving a little bit here and there to the lenders, on just pure upside. And it was frustrating. I think if that had happened to me maybe 5 years ago, it would have been devastating. But to me now, it's just the nature of things. But it's very challenging to predict. It's very challenging to operate, and it's very challenging to create projections that align with reality in this business, because it happens so regularly that you essentially have to project for things to not actually happen and actually go through.
Yeah, I mean, I relate to this so much, and I'm sure much of the audience is shaking their head in agreement because last week I had one where day of closing, the buyer shows up with an envelope full of cash for the down payment. It was a seller finance deal, and it was a small one, but he didn't. This is still so bizarre because my agent was communicating with him and everything, but he just bought enough for the down payment and didn't have money for any of his closing costs. And then he freaked out, he left, and then he backed out. And anyways, there's a lot to dissect there that's neither here nor there for this podcast, but it just happens all the time. So, what do you do, Mason? How do you run your business, make plans for your just personal expenses, for your business expenses, for everything when it's so uncertain?
Yeah, and I think, for this episode, I'll kind of try and narrow the scope just to my actual land businesses versus, the job that I have, developing, where I get weekly paychecks and, what's turning into weekly pretty large commission checks as well. But whenever I was just running the land business, I think, looking at our notes here, trying to create as many metrics as possible to anticipate what's actually going to occur, I think is really beneficial. But before that, and Dan, you and I have talked about this at length at this point of how do you actually generate monthly revenue, just to cover whatever your fixed operating expenses and personal expenses are. And I think that's to try and sell as much land as possible on notes. So where you have the monthly checks coming in that kind of cover your fixed expenses. But I think creating whenever you get a deal under contract, and I'll try and answer your question as succinctly as possible, but I might ramble a little bit. Um, when you get a deal under contract, I think, look at the comps, do all the stuff that you're taught and that you anticipate to occur, create the general anticipated time it's going to take for the deal to go full cycle based on all the data that you can. Add 15% to that and subtract 15%, from what the anticipated close cost is. And I think that is a kind of decent framework that you can create to, conservatively project what your future income is going to look like. Because what frustrates me so much is all the land gurus out there that talk about this metric that, they call it pipeline profit. And it's tricky to determine what pipeline profit is because, is it like when you get a property under contract to buy, or is it when you get a lead in? And like all of them have different metrics where it's like, yeah, with all my leads, I've got like 4 billion in pipeline profit lined up for the rest of time. But I think, to create like a good operating framework in my mind, to summarize, try and get something on a monthly basis of monthly recurring revenue. Whether that's, land notes or commission from realtor deals or whatever it might be. And then for all of your projections, add 15% on the back end of the length of time that you expect it to sell and reduce the sale price by 15%. And that's, I don't know, a decent operating framework in my mind. I'll pause.
Yeah, I think it's different than where my mind went, but that's a great way to think about it and a fairly conservative way to think about it. What I wanted to add was a bit of advice on accepting offers for your properties. And I'll give a contrasting two examples here where I have one property under contract where before we accepted the offer, we had a thorough conversation with the buyer about everything they were going to do, why they needed a due diligence period, what they were going to do in that period. And it's all things that I'm 99% sure will not be problematic. They want to officially get a septic permit. We had this thing tested. It's great soil. And then they just want to verify that it is allowable to build what they want to build. And I already did that. And so I feel really good about that. Whereas if I had an inexperienced realtor and I was inexperienced, and I've seen this, where you get an offer and there is simple due diligence that is part of their offer that could be solved in a few days before even going under contract. And realtors want to, inexperienced realtors might say, oh, take that offer. No, 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 no. First, okay, they want to know X, Y, and Z. Just go figure that out. I don't want to take their offer until those things are figured out. And so what all this is leading to, the one deal I mentioned where we verified everything, that's a mistake deal from 2 years ago that I'm finally selling. And so I didn't push for non-refundable earnest money because it's the first offer we got in 2 years. I think we're good. I looked them up. They're a real builder. But the reason when I look at the deals I've done, I have had so few deals fall out of contract in North Carolina because it is standard on the contract for them to put up non-refundable earnest money in the form of a due diligence fee. And when people put up non-refundable earnest, it's very rare that they back out. Sometimes they still do. I've kept a number of earnest money receipts or due diligence fees and earnest money just from having gone past their inspection period. But it's far less likely that they back out. So much of how certain your pipeline profit is comes back to the due diligence you did on your buyer when they made an offer and how you arrange that deal to determine upfront how serious are they.
Yeah, I think you made a lot of good points there. And it's a really good way to, whenever you have a challenge property specifically, to not go in and out of contract over and over and over again. I think that's part of the just disclosure language. But, for like properties I've got listed for you, Dan, where I try and do as much lead qualification as possible on the front end of, hey, here's all of the answers to all of your questions. That way, especially if we're selling on an owner finance deal where you don't have to get a loan or anything like that, the approval process is pretty simple. It's just, all right, well, pick your closing date. Does next week work for you type of thing, 5-day inspection period or no inspection period whatsoever. And sometimes you just wrap the earnest money into the down payment and you don't even, go through additional phases with the process. I think is a really, really powerful way to do it. And then I think to kind of expand on your point, understand who your buyer is, where there's properties that, I'm buying that I need 6 months to 12 months of due diligence because it's going to take that long to get all the necessary approvals. And yeah, there's a risk at that where after a certain period of time, the due diligence, period, earnest money will go hard at some point during that contract period and stuff like that. And we're risking that. We're spending a lot of money on engineers and surveys and all this kind of stuff. But if it's just someone looking to like buy a piece of rural land, they don't need a 6-month close. And typically when when I see people making offers with a 6-month close, uh, most of the time it's a wholesaler. That's just going to be a frustrating person to deal with. And then the other time they just don't understand. And so you have to spend the time with them of, I spent half an hour on the phone with, a potential buyer for one of your lots yesterday, Dan, to just go over absolutely everything and explain, hey, here's the ones that are accessed by easement. Here's the ones that are county road. This is why there's price differences and this, then, and the other thing. And I think, um, the more vetting you can do as far forward in the pipeline as possible, going back to the initial acquisition, to make sure you know what you're actually buying, so you can resolve all of those potential due diligence items, is going to lead to the point where whenever you actually start getting offers, um, they're going to have a greater likelihood of closing.
Yeah, a lot of good points made there. And just as we're talking through this, so much of here, it's a spectrum, it's never guaranteed, but there are things you can do so that your likelihood of pipeline profit actually coming to fruition goes up. And that's really what we're doing. How do you take it from, maybe a 40 or 50% chance to close to 70, 80, 90%? And each step of the way, you know, you add in non-refundable earnest, okay, that percentage goes up. You check all their due diligence boxes ahead of time, okay, that goes up quite a bit. And that's really what you're describing there, Mason. You're making sure that your buyer is fully informed of good, bad, and in between about the property, so that they don't have something that they find through their in their due diligence and then back out. So I think that's all good info. One more thing I wanted to say on this, just as an example. Again, it's just a spectrum. You never know for sure, but an example of one that I think has a really high probability of closing in my pipeline. The buyer is a 1031 buyer who already sold the other property. The funds are sitting in her escrow account. She has to place them. She did a 2-week close and 1,000 non-refundable earnest money. That's a pretty darn high chance that that's gonna go through. She could still back out, maybe she will, but as far as the spectrum goes, I'd put that towards the more certain than the, 2-month escrow to a halfway interested builder.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, we're trying to get tactical and also deal with the mindset, of this. Of I had a closing that occurred, shoot, I guess maybe a week and a half ago, on a seller finance loan that I did to a builder. He paid quarterly interest payments for just over a year on it, and we had a closing date scheduled for March 31st or March 30th or something like that. And it seemed clear cut. I had already started allocating what I was going to do with the money of, I'm going to, pay off this. I'm going to, buy this. I'm going to do all this, do all that. And then it got delayed. And that was one of those circumstances where, kind of like your 1031 buyer, like you expected of like, this is, a closing date for someone that's going to be moving into this home of like a primary residential home. And what caused the delay was out of the hands of the builder. And it wasn't a big deal at the end of the day because I just kept collecting more interest money. And, a week and a half ago, I got, 304,000 back in my account, which was a really great feeling. But the electric company, there was a bunch of turnover at the electric company and they had not, hooked up the pedestal to like actually put electric in the house so the builder could finish everything, and order final inspection and everything like that. And so it was just one thing after another that delayed it 2 months, which was fine because I got another, 3,000 or 4,000 in interest from that time period. But I think regardless of the surety that you have that the person is going to close because of, it's a legitimate business owner, or even there's a, timeline associated with like a, regulatory code or whatever related to a 1031 exchange or whatever it might be, is hiccups are always going to happen. And so the tactical point that I'm making is luckily all the stuff I had lined up wasn't on a deadline where it was like, okay, well, I'm going to, close on this deal, get 300 grand back, and I'm going to buy a $200,000 property 2 weeks after it. It was all stuff that didn't have that, because I think as soon as you start creating these timelines in your head with the expectation of a closing occurring on a different date, one, that's going to ruin your reputation with whoever you're buying from. And two, it's going to, potentially screw you over financially in the long run because you're not going to be able to close because, there's so many things that could and can happen in this business that as soon as you start operating with absolute certainty, you're going to shoot yourself in the foot because, and that's, one of the additional points that we want to make on this is like, when you have these closings that are occurring, we're always thinking about what's the next thing is versus like just sitting on the funds and kind of waiting and, reevaluating what our expenses, are going to be of, do I acquire another property with this? Do I pay down, investors with this? Do I hire another employee with this money? And the thing is, this business takes a really long time to build successfully. So whenever you have like these big things coming in, don't necessarily like start allocating the funds early. I think is the long-winded point that I'm trying to make, on this.
Yeah, 100%. So let's get more tactical because, well, you have to plan. You have to have salaries, marketing expenses. And so what I think about is just always having contingencies, 2 or 3 or even 4 contingencies. And the first of which is just having extra liquidity in both cash and lines of credit. That's the biggest one in my mind because, again, oftentimes things will sell eventually, but just like your example, maybe it'll be in 2 months. Maybe the first one won't go through. I had a good deal last year that just comes to mind where I remember like the first 2 buyers backed out, and then it still ended up selling 9 months later. It was still a good deal. It just didn't go through on the expected timeline. And so having extra liquidity, over time, you ride those get through those valleys, and then the money often still hits unless you really messed up. Number 2, having, funders and investors for the closing of properties. Because sure, the marketing and salaries are a decent overhead, but the big numbers in my business are the outlays of cash for acquisition. And so always having backups there where, okay, my cash didn't come back. I don't have 100 grand for this. Already having people in place that can fund deals for you. I'd say that's number 2. And then I just want to reemphasize what you said, because this has become more and more top of mind for me, is just selling more on terms. So you do have a recurring book of business or revenue stream just to cover your overhead. So those are the main 3 things I'm doing. I have a few other thoughts, but I want to pause there.
Yeah, I think those are all really good ways to think about it and really good action items that you can do. And I think to make a quick caveat is with the funders that you're working with whenever you're in this period of time. I think whenever you go into a deal with the assumption that you're about to have a big liquidity event because you have this closing that's supposedly going to occur, that you're projecting is going to occur, you might start thinking, oh, I can take this, hard money loan, or I can, maybe take a more aggressive debt structure because I'll be able to just pay off my lender, in a month or something like that whenever this deal closes, as versus using, someone that does an equity split with me. And I think that's where you end up shooting yourself in the foot because you're like, okay, well, I need my next deal. The easiest option here is hard money. I've got enough for a down payment or whatever, and I can, service the debt. But I think that right there is like this just mindset battle that you have, because theoretically, if you pay off the hard money lender in a month, you're going to spend a lot less money than you would if you did a equity split with a 50-50 or a 70-30 partner or something like that on the deal. But should your closing not occur and then this deal doesn't exactly go how you want that. That's how the problems really start snowballing. And I think that's how so many people have gotten crushed in this business is because um, they acquire deals when they didn't necessarily need to, in a structure that didn't necessarily make sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like what's happening to a lot of commercial investors in multifamily and office and retail. Well, retail's still doing pretty well overall, but there's balloon notes that they have to pay off with much higher debt now, and it's the same problem with a lot of land investors. They have a note, probably hard to refi, that doesn't sell in time, and they got to find 100 grand, 200, whatever, 400 grand, uh, and that can be a problem.
Mhm.
Yeah. So one other thing that's been top of mind for me, again, thinking of that conversation I referenced with a friend of mine out here, how do you make your business more liquid? And, what he's been doing, he has been doing a lot of houses and mobile homes in conjunction with the land. And one of the things he said to me is, my profits aren't necessarily better, but my ability and certainty of sale is so much higher because these are entry level homes that people really need. And so it's the same story where any closing could fall apart, but when it's a necessity for someone and it's where they're going to have as their shelter, they're gonna do everything they can to close, and so this is something I've been thinking a lot about. I'm working on personally in my business, working on doing quite a few more builds, entry-level builds, to have a larger portion of my inventory be more liquid and sell quicker, or at least that's my thesis.
Yeah, no, I think that this is probably one of the most important parts of this show besides the mindset stuff of, making the assumption that not every deal is going to close and don't allocate the funds too early or anything like that is build the business that's actually sustainable to last where you've got, in my mind, like three-ish buckets of revenue within your company. You've got the first one, which is like owner finance land notes. Of it covers your salary, it covers your your fixed costs, your expenses, and that sort of thing. And that could be anywhere from $5,000 to $20,000 a month of recurring revenue. And then you've got your flip bucket of your simple land flips or your minor subdivisions, which whenever they sell, yeah, you could sell some on notes or you could sell some for cash, and it'll take a while, but that money you're doubling your money essentially on every deal that you do like that. And then you've got this third bucket that you're talking about, Dan, where, the process takes a while, call it 6 to 12 months, for each one. But if you could structure it correctly, where it's like, yeah, you spent 200 grand, but you made 20 grand on this deal, to build a home or build a manufactured house or whatever it might be. But you have a pretty much guaranteed sale every month, making, netting 240 grand a year or something like that. That's how you actually create what amounts to be, $1 million business because you've got those certainty deals or essentially certainty deals whenever you're creating product that people need, entry level housing or, affordable housing or whatever that might be. Um, which to me, that's the perfect business right here. And I think if you can operate with those three things in mind by starting out scaling the note business, to have that recurring revenue, adding the big flips, and then adding kind of the certain deals, that kind of eliminates a lot of the challenges. So whenever one of those flip deals doesn't close on time or something like that, it doesn't matter because you've got the monthly income plus the certainty of the housing close or something like that.
Yeah, yeah, I think those are all good points. Now, part of this whole conversation we've alluded to but haven't really directly spoken to is the mindset. How do you stay sane when you wake up thinking you're gonna have 100 grand come in that day or whatever it might be, and then nothing comes in? And for me, it's not easy, right? It's always a challenge of the business, but I try and just think about hitting the lead measures I need to hit and doing the things I need to do and not really, I don't want to say not celebrating wins, but just remaining pretty stoic regardless of whether it's a good or a bad day, and not letting whether a closing went through determine whether I have a good day. Um, I guess probably the simplest way to say it is trying to remove my sense of well being from how business is going, which is, again, easier said than done. But I think that keeping it top of mind and making an effort helps. And just, again, did I get the lead measures done that I need to get done is a good way to decide whether it was a good day or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there's probably a cadence that you should look at your financials. I think some people look at their bank account every day. And I think, some people are looking, at, dreaming and wishing as versus managing all the tasks of, okay, here's everything that I currently have listed. Here's every active project that I have going on. Have I done all of the tasks necessary every single day? Because you're going to get those dopamine hits. From completing tasks. And then whenever, the money comes in, that's just nice. And you should celebrate, whenever you have a big closing and, because like you should tie, I don't know, something to it because that's the point of all of this is to make money, and to build something big. And I think Dan, I think you do a pretty decent job of just like living your life, how
Mhm.
you want it, on, your own terms on a daily basis. And then some people might want to do, a big trip or something like that. But I think just seeking the dopamine from task completion rather than from a project coming, to fruition or a closing occurring probably helps keep you a little bit more sane. I think, just because it, it's hard. Like this is a really hard thing to deal with, and like whenever you have all these expectations that you're operating on, and all the assumptions that you're operating on, that don't happen all the time, you start questioning and doubting yourself, and being like, "Do I actually know what I'm doing here?" And it's just a timing thing. With all of this, assuming that you're investing with like a good thesis, for every deal that you're actually doing.
Yep. And, along with all this, I'd say another thing that gets missed or lost on a lot of podcasts or just conversations about investing in general, we talked about entry level housing being pretty liquid, right? Well, this is true just within land. The cheaper lots do tend to sell more reliably. So I had a closing go through this morning. It was 93 acres. It was a great deal. We made a lot of money, but it took, well, I think we closed it 6 months ago, and that was pretty good. Honestly, I thought it might take longer to sell. Whereas a lot of these smaller lots, and part of the reason why I don't necessarily agree with, at least for my own business, the stopping, some people, "Oh, I don't wanna deal unless I'm gonna make 6 figures." Well, you're getting up to multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars there as far as the price points, and there are just fewer people that can buy that sort of thing, and especially if you're anywhere rural. I mean, if you're close to a major city or in the outskirts of one, there might be more of a market for that, but for a lot of us that are doing business in, the Midwest or the Southeast, the rural Southeast, there's not a lot of money, and there are fewer people that can get a loan for or have cash for 300, 400, $500,000 land. Um, and so having those smaller deals, maybe where the resales under 100, let's call it, can be really valuable because they tend to be more liquid. I think about last year, and there were some really slow times last year, and thankfully, I had a pipeline along with the bigger stuff of just simple infill lots, then those sold really reliably and helped us get through those slow times. So, I think that's underappreciated as well.
Yeah, it definitely is, and I think that where people tend to fail with this part of the mindset is, bigger is always better, scale, 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 all this type of, all these different things. It's so much easier to do a 50 lot subdivision or a 100 lot subdivision than it is to flip, 50 lots or 100 individual lots. And the problem is during that development period of however long it might take to get those 50 lots and however much you're spending on it, you have absolutely no money coming in if you don't have anything else going on. And so unless you've created, 18 months of reserves for you, you still need those small buckets in your life that will pay your bills and pay your operating expenses to keep acquiring, good deals. And I think, for me, where I've got fixed income coming in, managing acquisitions and development for this company that, allows me to not do the small deals myself, but still, I'm like, okay, well, winter is a very slow period of time for us. We essentially don't do any sales during the winter. So, what projects am I acquiring now for myself that I could potentially sell in a different market in the winter that is going to allow me to, keep that, level of income coming through and everything like that. And so, regardless of where you're at, whether you're working a full-time job inside or outside of the industry, or, you're doing this full time, I think that creating those buckets just it makes the uncertainty of this business just so much less stressful. Because there have been times, for me specifically, where I was like, dude, I don't know if I want to keep doing this anymore. Like you would have these months where you know, I'd send out 200,000, to go buy more and more properties and have no money coming in whatsoever. Or maybe like a $300 a month note payment or something like that. And I'm like looking at my cash flow and I'm like, dude, I can't do this forever. And then you have enough go right and you wait long enough and everything like that. But I think, if whether you're starting out or you're looking at an opportunity to kind of refresh your business, this is how we would recommend doing it.
One of the most important things that I've forgotten to say this whole time is how you act when these things go wrong. And the worst thing you can do is stop buying good deals and stop your marketing. I think about some of the ups and downs of mid to late 2024 till now. So really the last 2 years, because it has been very peaky and valley-y, for lack of a better word. There have been peaks and valleys. And I think of a few times when sales had gone really poorly, or there was a moment about a year ago where I had 12 different deals fall out of contract to sell in like 40 days. And that was awful. And I remember sitting there looking at a HUD for another one I was supposed to buy. And I was ready to just say, fuck it, we're not buying this, and firing everyone and just selling off everything and doing something else. And thankfully I didn't, and we bought it, and then that deal that we bought ended up selling immediately. And then I had just a flurry of sales, and I got that kind of regression to the mean. And so I am so glad I didn't make a bad decision and not buy another good deal. Now, keep in mind everything we said about how you're structuring those buys. We already hit on that, so I won't beat a dead horse. But man, I there's been a few moments where I felt really uncomfortable buying because sales had been slow or a bunch had just fallen on a contract. And if it is a good deal and you did your due diligence, you should always buy it. And if you need to just give away half of it so that you have a no risk funded type of deal, then give away half of it. But don't not buy it. That's the most important thing.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Because during those really rough times, I was not buying because I just needed stuff to sell because I was unwilling to take on more debt or, bring more lenders into the fold. And, that was the wrong decision because there were plenty of deals that came across my desk that would have been good and helped me, dig out of that hole essentially. So I think as we start kind of moving towards the end, like I want to hit you guys with some more tactical advice on these deals that aren't closing. Like Dan, whenever you had like a dozen deals essentially like right at the same time all fall through. Um, sometimes it's just an anomaly, but a lot of the times there's a reason behind it. I highly recommend, for everybody that has a deal that doesn't fall or that falls through, whenever you get it under contract and they back out for one reason, keep track of why that occurred. Was
Mhm.
it, buyer, was unable to perform, because of, they couldn't secure lending, and if they couldn't secure lending, was it the buyer's fault or was it there an issue with the land of, the bank didn't think it was as worth as much as what it was? Was it a due diligence failure issue? Was it, what caused that issue to occur? And keep a log to that. And I think, on this, especially if you guys have acquisition managers that are getting a percentage of the commission on this, don't allow the assumption that the deal is going to close to go to your acquisition manager too. Teach them and train them whenever you're training salespeople that nothing is real until the deal closes. Because I have seen this in the sales world and sales community so often that you start counting that commission check before it's actually hit your account and you go, spend $5,000 on a whatever. And then that commission check never actually comes. So whenever you're building a culture, I think it creates a culture of follow through on the acquisitions and the sales process to make sure that you're communicating every step of the way to do everything in your power to ensure that that deal closes.
And that's a great point. I love doing the, post mortem, both good and bad, on what did we do that was correct, that went right? What did we do that went wrong? What did we do wrong, but we got lucky and it went through anyways, trying to separate the decision from the outcome a bit. And So going back to what I said about buying good deals, even if sales have been slow, it's really important. And I'm not speaking to the newbie. I'm talking to people that have been in business. And, I look at that deal, a year ago that I did buy. And when I looked at that, I said, no, this is just idiotic if I don't buy this. This is a phenomenal deal. It ended up being that we bought it at like 37 and sold it at 90 quickly. There was one this year where we recently bought it, and I mean, I wasn't in that state of mind that I was a year ago, but I still remember looking at it, and the sales have been slower and we're buying a lot all at once. And so I was feeling a little bit of that feeling like, man, do we really want to buy this? And I read back through all our notes, all our due diligence, and said, no, I'm being ridiculous. This is a great deal. We bought it and went under contract at like 2.3 times what we bought it within a week. So, um, anyways, I'm rambling now, but if you know your fundamentals, stick to them, even if you're not feeling good because a bunch of deals fell out of contract or for whatever reason, but stick to the fundamentals. For one more thing you hit on that's so important, Mason, that I should have said at the beginning, your personal expenses. You gotta keep your personal expenses under control and not go crazy when you have good months. And what this means from one person to another changes. If you've been doing this for 10 years and you have $50,000 in notes coming in a month, well, maybe 100, then your version of under control could be you spend 20 grand a month, maybe. I don't know. But you need, I think, to keep your personal expenses well under what your recurring revenue is.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, it can be really easy in this business to not hold yourself to a budget, both on the business side and the personal side, especially whenever you're on a hot streak of you're like, it doesn't matter. I spent, 15,000 going out to eat this month, and I bought a new car and bought a new watch and, did whatever. Um, and then you have a few bad months in a row, and then you had some business expenses come up that you weren't anticipating, and then you suddenly have, a $50,000 credit card bill that you can't pay off that's, accumulating, $3,000 a month in interest fees and stuff like that. And I think that's the goal of this show is like, don't operate in the world of assumption and build a business that, kind of creates a few guarantees so that when things don't go according to plan, you're still able to function, you're still able to buy the good deals, and you're still able to, operate a successful business.
I've got to just to summarize, Mason. If you don't have anything else, I have to tell a story from early on. I remember, I don't know if this was 2020, so I was still pretty new in the business. Only been flipping land for a little while. And my older buddy that actually got me into the deal or into the business had funded a few deals for me because I didn't have a ton of money, at least compared to what I was doing. And we were under contract to sell a couple, and I remember him calling, and I don't know how exactly the conversation went, but it was something along the lines of, "Oh yeah," I told him we have this one selling on X date, and then this one on Y date, so we should have this, this cash back to you here, and this cash back to you there, and I'm gonna make this, and he just kind of chuckles, like, "What?" He goes, "Did they put up non-refundable earnest money?" I'm like, "No." He just laughs at me again. He's like, "You're new, you're inexperienced, and you will learn one day." And for our listeners, I have learned. And so when people tell you that they're under contract and there's no hard earnest money, it doesn't really mean much. Anyways, guys, that is it for us today. Let us know if you like these episodes, good, bad. Give us feedback. But until next time, Dan Habercost and Mason McDonald with the Big Picture Blueprint signing off.